Jesus was 12 years old when Scripture last shows us his childhood. He was sitting among the teachers in the temple, listening, asking questions, and astonishing everyone with his understanding. Then, something unusual happens. The Bible becomes almost completely silent. The next major moment comes when Jesus is about 30 years old, standing at the Jordan River and preparing to begin his public ministry. That leaves roughly 18 years we know very little about. So what happened during the silent years of Jesus? And why does the Bible tell us so little? Here's what most people miss. The man who would calm storms and raise the dead spent 30 years doing nothing the world would call remarkable. No crowds, no teaching, no miracles recorded. Just a quiet life in a small town nobody respected, Nazareth. Most of us grew up assuming Jesus stepped out of childhood and straight into his ministry. But here's what the Bible actually says. He went home. He obeyed Mary and Joseph. He learned to work with his hands. He lived a life so ordinary that when he finally began teaching, the people asked, "Isn't this the carpenter?" So why? Why would God spend 30 years preparing for just 3 years of public ministry? Why the silence? The answer isn't a footnote in history. It changes how you understand your own quiet season. First, we need to be careful. The phrase, "the 18 silent years," is a useful description, but it is not a phrase found in the Bible. Scripture does not give us a detailed biography of Jesus between childhood and ministry. In Luke chapter 2, Jesus is 12 years old when he travels with Mary and Joseph to Jerusalem. After his parents find him in the temple, Jesus says, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" Then Luke tells us that Jesus returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And the passage ends with these words, "Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men." That is one of the most important descriptions of Jesus' hidden years. The Son of God lived quietly. He grew in wisdom, he grew physically, and he lived in obedience. Nazareth was not a famous city. It was not the center of political power. It was not Jerusalem. It was a small, ordinary place. And yet this is where Jesus spent most of his earthly life before beginning his ministry. Think about that. Jesus did not begin preaching at 12. He did not gather crowds as a teenager. He did not rush into public attention. He returned home. He lived among ordinary people, and he waited. The Bible does not describe every conversation, every day, or every task. But it does show us something clear. Jesus was not inactive. He was growing. He was learning. He was preparing. Sometimes we think that if nothing dramatic is happening, God must be doing nothing. But Jesus' quiet years remind us that hidden does not mean meaningless. When Jesus eventually returned to Nazareth and began teaching publicly, the people were surprised. They asked, "Is this not the carpenter?" Mark chapter 6 also records the question, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary?" This tells us that Jesus was known for ordinary work. The word translated as carpenter can also refer to a craftsman or builder. The Bible does not give us a complete description of his daily occupation, but it does show that the people recognized him as someone who worked with his hands. Before Jesus preached to crowds, he lived an ordinary working life. Before he healed the sick, he knew the discipline of labor. Before people called him rabbi, he was known in his hometown as a craftsman. And this is where the story becomes deeply meaningful. God was not only present in the miracles, God was present in the ordinary years. Many people also ask what happened to Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus. Joseph appears in the early chapters of Matthew and Luke. But after Jesus' childhood, Joseph is not mentioned again in the same way. Some Christians believe Joseph may have died before Jesus began his public ministry. That is possible, but the Bible never directly tells us when Joseph died or exactly what happened to him, so we should not present that possibility as certain. This is an important lesson when studying biblical mysteries. We should distinguish between what Scripture says, what history suggests, and what later tradition claims. The Bible tells us that Jesus grew up in Nazareth. It tells us that he was obedient to Mary and Joseph. It tells us that he became known as a carpenter. But it does not give us permission to invent details. The silence of Scripture should lead us to humility, not speculation. Over the centuries, many stories have been created about Jesus' childhood. Some traditions claim that he traveled to distant countries. Others describe secret teachers, hidden journeys, or miracles that are not recorded in the Gospels. But these stories are not part of the biblical record. The four Gospels do not focus on Jesus' childhood adventures. Instead, they focus on his identity, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. The silence is not an invitation to believe every dramatic story. It is an invitation to trust what God chose to reveal. The Bible may not tell us everything we want to know, but it tells us what we need to know. Luke chapter 3 says that Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Why 30? Scripture does not give us one simple sentence explaining the timing, but we can see that Jesus was not controlled by pressure. He did not begin before the appointed time. He did not need to prove himself. He did not need constant attention. For nearly 3 decades, he lived faithfully before only a small number of people. Then, at the right time, he stepped into public ministry. This is the part we often miss. Jesus' public work lasted only a few years, but his private preparation lasted much longer. God was not wasting those years, and he is not wasting your quiet season either. The hidden years of Jesus teach us at least 3 important lessons. First, God works in quiet seasons. You may feel forgotten because your life does not look dramatic, but silence does not mean abandonment. Second, ordinary work has value. Jesus spent years in a life that looked normal to everyone around him. Faithfulness is not less spiritual because it happens in a workplace, a home, or a quiet routine. Third, preparation takes time. Jesus did not rush into his calling. He grew in wisdom, he lived in obedience, and he waited for the right moment. Sometimes we want the platform before the preparation, but God often builds character where no one is watching. So what happened during the 18 silent years of Jesus? The honest answer is this: the Bible does not tell us every detail, but it tells us enough. Jesus grew in wisdom. He lived in obedience. He worked with his hands. He remained faithful in an ordinary place. And when the appointed time came, he began the ministry that would change the world. The hidden years were not empty years. They were years of preparation, faithfulness, and perfect obedience. So if your life feels quiet right now, do not assume that God has forgotten you. The unseen years may be preparing you for something you cannot yet see. The Bible is full of surprises when we slow down and read it carefully. If this message encouraged you, Subscribe for more cinematic Bible stories and biblical truths that strengthen your faith.